How's it going, everybody? So we're going to get started and obviously talk about the Chauvin trial. But before we do, I'm just going to, quickly acknowledge that I just dunked all over a Twitter shill today. So let me see if I can share my screen here. I don't go, it's a little bit Twitter drama, like Twitter specific or extremely online, but I just had a lot of fun with this, right? Like, basically, I was arguing with this guy who's, head of vice president of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance, which is like a Koch organization, and about big tech funding. He accused me of making up the censorship issue. But finally, at one point, he tweeted something, and the only person who liked his tweet was literally the head of Twitter policy. I was just dying when I saw that. I don't know. I think that's extraordinarily funny. But anyway, you're not here for that. And I don't want to spend all day, just going over a Twitter dunk. So let's talk about the Chauvin trial if we can. So if you recall, 2 days ago, I tweeted that, did a whole Periscope on the idea that Derek Chauvin would be acquitted. And people were saying to me, that was before all the medical expert testimony. So that was before Tobin. That was before, I forget exactly what her name is, Lindsay Thomas. That was before the actual medical examiner. And so people have said to me after that testimony, am I still thinking that he'll be acquitted? Because that testimony, to be clear, was much better for the prosecution than previous days. Just in general, we're talking about a situation where things have gotten, the actual prosecution put on witnesses that said what they wanted them to say that weren't easily converted into defense witnesses, and generally made things much easier. Or that created a possibility that you could say, oh, wow, actually, maybe they did prove that Derek Chauvin is the cause of death. But I still think that I still think ultimately what's going to happen is you're still going to have an acquittal because you're still going to have reasonable doubt on a couple of the relevant questions. I still think you're going to have reasonable doubt ultimately on causation. And I also think you're going to have reasonable doubt on whether or not Derek Chauvin was negligent. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview, and we'll talk specifically about what they said. So at the core, the basic thrust of the prosecution expert witnesses was George Floyd died of lack of oxygen, asphyxia. That asphyxia doesn't leave physical symptoms on the body or physical manifestations in the body during the autopsy. So it's something that you don't necessarily are able to diagnose via autopsy. You can diagnose lack of oxygen, but how they lost that oxygen is going to be unclear. And that basically Floyd had what's called positional asphyxia, which I think is the combination of being held down on the pavement with his hands being jammed into his back and the knee on the neck, somehow all combined to reduce the amount of oxygen that Floyd was able to get into his bloodstream and ultimately lead him to die of low oxygen. And part of the issue is that they're going to have to deal with the fact that lingering in the background is the fact that George Floyd had 11 nanograms per milliliter of fentanyl in his bloodstream. And fentanyl at that level, that's a 3 times a lethal dose of fentanyl. A number of the experts would testify that, they've diagnosed fentanyl overdoses at a lower level than that. And moreover, that the, lack of oxygen is ultimately the way people die from a fentanyl overdose. So, if they say the cause of death is lack of oxygen, it's like, well, there are 2 possible causes for that lack of oxygen. There's one, the physical restraint from the police officers holding him prone on the ground, reducing his ability and capacity to breathe. And then the other is some sort of response to the fentanyl, or perhaps even, the combination of the fentanyl and his heart disease or something like that. And ultimately, the experts, including Dr. Tobin, who's a very, very smart guy, right? Dr. Tobin, as you can see, a very, very serious expert witness who, clearly is one of the top people in the world in pulmonology. Grant him all that. And he was very confident that this was not an overdose, and other witnesses were too. But other witnesses also conceded that if they had found this body at home even without George Floyd's heart problems and Floyd's level of fentanyl in the system, she would diagnose the death as an overdose. Similarly, the medical examiner who did the autopsy said that if he had found Floyd alone at home, it would have concluded that it was an overdose. So what they're relying on is the existence of this video, and they're saying, sorry, this was something else I did. They're relying on the existence of the video and saying, because we see the video, we see that actually it's really suffocation. It's not an overdose, because if it were an overdose, he would have manifested different symptoms. He would have manifested like he would have gone into a coma, or he would have his respiratory rate would have declined. And I just like immediately, just as a lawyer thinking about questions, like I can think of some confounding things to ask, like, well, would methamphetamine change someone's breathing rate necessarily? Would all the adrenaline and the stress of being under police arrest change the speed at which someone breathes? Because it strikes me that breathing rate like is not some static thing, in your body. I mean, it just seems like there's things that could control that. Similarly, like, does the comatose thing happen, always in every case of a fentanyl overdose? That wasn't really made clear or explained. And because of that, I think in a world where there are defense experts coming, I think they're going to be able to establish reasonable doubt, right? No doubt that don't doubt that the defense has an expert that's going to get up and say this was likely a fentanyl overdose. That's coming, right? That expert is coming. We've only been doing prosecution witnesses so far. We haven't gotten to the defense. And all you need is reasonable doubt, right? At the end of the day, if you think there's a 5% probability that it was a fentanyl overdose, that's going to be acquittal just on that. And then the second thing is the medical, there's a little bit of a mismatch between the medical testimony and the cause of death. And because a big hunk of what Dr. Chauvin was getting at was the fact that because Floyd was pinned down to the pavement, he wasn't able to expand his chest. That was a big part of why his breathing was so labored. And he just demonstrated a lot of the physical things that Floyd was doing to try and create some leverage to lift his chest up. And I was actually very taken by that. I thought that was very persuasive, but I also noted that's not the part of Derek Chauvin's behavior that people said was an excessive use of force, right? Like pinning a subject down on the ground who they think is going to go through excited delirium is police practice that's taught to them. So they have to focus on and prove that it was the knee on the neck that really caused the breathing problems, not the knee on the chest. And I thought that whereas Chauvin was very persuasive about how, like, if you hold somebody's chest down, it makes it really hard for them to expand their lungs unless to get necessary oxygen. And if you push their arms back into their chest, I get that. But then the knee on the neck, like he made points that like at plenty of times the knee was on the back of the neck and not like anywhere near the airway. And even when it was on the side, it's like Floyd was able to just kind of move and not be in a position where he's breathing. So, or be in a position to be able to avoid any occlusion, right? Because it's not like a front choke or anything like that. It's like it's like one, it's either from the back, those back tendons, which Chauvin demonstrated were tougher on the side. And so, I just saw like, are you guys really sure? Did you guys actually prove that it was the knee on the neck that had anything to do with Floyd's death here? I really don't think they did that effectively. And so at the end of the day, I do not think that there will be, I think especially after the expert witnesses present, I think there will still be reasonable doubt. So let's take a look at some of these comments. Somebody says Nelson is doing a great job. I agree. I think Nelson is doing a great job in terms of crossing. And one of the things you'll notice is that when he was cross-examining these witnesses, he was being very careful not to try and get in debates with them, because it's one thing when you're examining a witness and you know what the answer is. It's another thing when you ask a witness something that's in their world of expertise, but not yours, because they can give like an open-ended answer that makes you look like a clown. As a result, you'll notice whenever Nelson was examining the medical experts, he was using what's called a leading question, like making a statement and then saying correct. Like that's a very consistent theme of how he crosses people, because he wants to keep them controlled, right? He doesn't want them just going off and being expansive. I thought he did a good job of that. And in general, did a good job in general. Somebody says, let's see. Dr. Thomas said any level amount of fentanyl in the body is lethal. The amount of fentanyl is irrelevant. That doesn't really make much sense when you think about it. Like some fentanyl could cause an overdose. Different people have different sensitivities, but the idea that more fentanyl wouldn't be relevant, I don't think that's what Dr. Thomas said. And that the amount, I seriously doubt that. Somebody says you have fentanyl patches and pills when the pain is bad, but it doesn't affect your breathing. That can be well and true, except for the fact that the prosecution's own experts testified about how they've diagnosed fentanyl overdoses at far lower levels than were found in George Floyd's bloodstream, how fentanyl does when it overdoses. It does lead to lack of oxygen and a death. So that's a real problem. Del Harmon says he still bets I'm wrong. The jury is afraid of the mob. The trial is a farce. He will be found guilty. I mean, you don't know anything about these jurors. And I just think in general, you get more surprise acquittals in circumstances like this than you get surprise guilty verdicts. Because remember, the burden is on the prosecution to prove every element beyond a reasonable doubt. And the ultimate consequence of finding them guilty is sending him away for 40 years. I just don't see it happening with the amount of doubt that I think is going to be in these jurors' minds. Somebody says street justice will get him. You can't reply. What? That's weird. Somebody says, Carrie says, oh, I like this. You're full of it. The privileged of being taxed to death so takers can sit back in their lazy entitled white lifestyles. All colors but whites are given preferential treatments in colleges. Stop blaming whitey. I assume this person is not talking to me. That's sort of a weird thing. I don't know. There's some strange comments coming from the Facebook world right now. Somebody said, is the toxicology report being disregarded? I don't think that the toxicology report is being disregarded. They're going to take it very seriously. Like that came up in detail in the testimony, especially with the guy who did the autopsy. Both of the medical examiners who testified said that if they'd found someone who died the way Floyd died in their home with Floyd's level of fentanyl, they would have diagnosed it as a fentanyl overdose. That's just such a massive problem for the prosecution, because normally there's not a causation issue. Like somebody gets shot, it's obvious the bullet caused their death, right? But here, the cause of death is lack of oxygen. Floyd had a lethal dose of fentanyl in his system, and fentanyl kills via asphyxia. So, like, that's a really high hill to climb. They have to prove that Floyd's asphyxia was not the result of the fentanyl overdose he had, beyond a reasonable doubt. And I just don't think they're going to end up getting there. I think that ultimately, with the benefit of the defense witnesses who are going to get up, the fact that Floyd spit out some pills in the back of the squad car right before he was put on the ground, I think all of this is going to cause major, major problems for the prosecution. Somebody says, you say there's too many witnesses with medical credentials who prove George Floyd's death. Chauvin only has his lawyer and no witness. This is where you're mistaken, right? We haven't seen the defense witnesses yet, because we're still in the middle of the prosecution's case in chief, right? We haven't gotten to the point where the defense can call its own witnesses and do its own direct examination. What I'm saying is that's coming, and I guarantee you 100% there is a medical expert witness for the defense that's going to get up and say this was an overdose death. Guarantee that's coming. And it's going to have good credentials and make a persuasive presentation. That's coming, right? What happens then? Like, how does the jury evaluate the claims of the competing experts beyond a reasonable doubt? It's going to be very, very challenging. Somebody says the fact that Floyd couldn't breathe before the street part tells me a lot. Yeah, I think it's very relevant. So that's very true. Let's look at Gina says, my son died from fentanyl, but that cop sucks for not getting him help. The thing is, I mean, they did though, right? They called in, the ambulance was on the way. They made it a code 3, which is lights and sirens. That's some of the other testimony that came earlier. People say the cops did nothing. It's like, no, they basically, my view, and who knows, I think Chauvin might testify to this actually, but my view of what happened is they thought he was very high on drugs, and they thought he was, he had basically, like, they had found it, they were unable to get him into the back of the squad car. 3 cops were unable to get him into the back of the squad car. So they're thinking excited delirium, and he's not just a danger to us, but he's a danger to himself. We should hold him down until the EMT gets here, and so they can get him a shot of ketamine and then get him to the hospital. Like that, I think was what's going through the officers' heads, right? We got to worry about this dude just exploding on us because we couldn't even get him in the back of a squad car. He's high. He's good. He's in real distress. Let's get the ambulance here ASAP and let's get him out of here. But until he's in the ambulance, we just need to keep him in the same place. And he screwed it up by like not making sure his breathing would be okay. That's my guess. Somebody says, you are probably in better condition that Floyd was. He was his own worst. That doesn't make a whole bunch of sense. Somebody said, what do you think about the fact that the judge asked one of the jurors about if they had a book deal? Yeah, that might be a reason to kick that juror off the jury. Jurors shouldn't be doing that. They should be focused on doing justice. It's actually kind of important they focus on their job and doing it properly. Let's see. Do I expect Chauvin to testify? I don't think he will, because it's so rare the defendants do. But I think there's actually, it's not unheard of for Chauvin to want to testify here and just, make a point of saying, like, make a point of basically trying to explain what he did and why. You know, one of the things you haven't heard in this trial is any of the officers trying to explain what they were doing and why they were doing it. And under the circumstances, Chauvin might well be like, look, there were reasons I did this. I had training. This is what I thought was the correct move. I was under the impression that if somebody was talking, they're breathing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's some reasonable chance here that Chauvin will testify, just because it's one of those cases where, you know, the question is not like, where was, you know, there's so many things that aren't at issue, right? Clearly Chauvin was there. What Chauvin did on video is obvious. Like there's not, so basically the only thing you know, maybe Crossex would be worried about getting him on like a hidden hateful motive or something. I don't know. But I don't think it's that obvious. Yeah. And Jess points out that Floyd has to be laid on the ground, that it's in the video. So somebody says, Chauvin didn't look so scared with his hands in his pockets. Perhaps he didn't look scared, but perhaps he was just like trying to get comfortable, right? Like just trying to keep the same position, trying to keep the guy from moving, right? We don't, like, the thing is, like, we really don't know exactly what was going through Derek Chauvin's mind. Maybe he'll go into the stand and testify about it. Somebody says, the settlement is outrageous. I heard it was paid by the insurance, and if true, they are a very stupid carrier. Had I been the insurer, I'd have waited for the trial. I would have too. I mean, that's a massive settlement. That is the kind of settlement you'd give to somebody if you were lost at trial. That's a really big settlement. Somebody says, yeah, the prosecution medical expert witness made a better case for a knee on the back as cause of asphyxiation. That's what I thought too. And the problem is there has to be a match between the negligent behavior and what caused asphyxiation, right? Like if Chauvin was trained to put the knee on the back, if that was police procedure to put the knee on the back to restrain a suspect under those circumstances, and it was that knee on the back that caused the death, then Chauvin didn't have any criminal intent, right? Chauvin wasn't negligent, and Chauvin didn't intend to kill, right? So there's no manslaughter, there's no murder under those circumstances, right? There has to be a connection between the knee on the neck and the death, and it's not obvious that there is one, right, under the circumstances. Somebody says, great content. Thank you. Hopefully, thank you. If you guys enjoy this and got value out of it, you know, there's a lot of things you can do. If you're on Facebook, hit the like button, facebook.com/humaneventsmedia. If you're youtube.com/humanevents, you should subscribe there and you can get access to the live streams. And I think YouTube can be better because you can exit out of the app or something. And then if you're on Twitter, because obviously Periscope is dead, but we're still having the death rattle of Periscope since these things are coming up. What you need to do is, I always have to do this on my mobile because this is where you do it. So if you see here, right, you see that little bell next to the following button, like right there, you hit that on your mobile app, and then it'll say, follow account notifications, only tweets with live video there at the bottom. You hit that, boom, and then you'll get access to my live videos when I get them done. Take a few more questions here. So yeah, again, you know, try and be fair and honest. Yeah, I mean, again, like I think no doubt that these witnesses were a lot better for the prosecution than were the previous ones. I mean, another lingering problem is that on use of force, I don't even think the prosecution proved its case. I do not think the prosecution effectively proved that that Chauvin even did anything negligent. Like, I don't think they got there. I think as a result of like really good cross-examinations. So somebody says, you know, Crowder demoed the Chauvin event. I mean, the question is, did Crowder do it accurately? I don't necessarily think it's as bad for Crowder to try and like, you know, it wasn't like an attempt to be mocking. It was evidentiary. It was an attempt to like explore the evidence. What do you think the state will do with mistrial? Oh, they'll try him again. Like they'll try him again with a mistrial. They'll try him again. I think Chauvin would need a not guilty to get off. Yeah. Somebody says even Mark Garagos is being fair. Oh, that's interesting. Mark Garagos. I actually want to like find where he's saying that. That's fascinating. I'll have to look at what that's about. Cool. All right. I think that'll be it for now. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. And do again, subscribe, like, follow on Twitter, whatever you're going to do. And there'll be more on this next week when we get started with, there'll just be more next week when the trial restarts. Anyway, thanks guys. Peace.